Hi, and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co host, Elwin Robinson, the creator of Genetic Insights and Feel Younger. And today we are discussing the most effective daily habits to keep you feeling vital and healthy. So, Elwin, tell me, let's kick off this list. Where do you want to start, and why are we talking about this today?
Well, because I feel like we've done a lot of episodes on different things to take and different things to buy, and I didn't want to make it seem like that's, the most important thing that you can do. Actually, the most important thing that you can do for your health and well-being and success in life and probably success in relationships and all kinds of areas is really focus on the daily habits that you have, which form really the foundation of, your life. So I wanted to do that justice and really focus on the things that I found are the most important. So yes, health and vitality, but really for feeling good. I didn't know what words to use for it. It's not quite feeling youthful because, a lot of people don't necessarily have 100% positive associations from being young, but it's just, like having that vitality, having that joy, maybe having the most positive aspects of youthfulness. I think the first one that I would like to start with, so the anti-aging kind of feeling youthful and vital habit that I think is super important is getting enough sleep.
And that's free of cost, potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd say the cost, of course, is time, right? And that's the number one resistance that I see people have to getting sufficient amount of sleep psychologically is feeling like it's a waste of time. And so I would say that investing in sleep is almost like investing in saving money in a high interest account, right? It doesn't feel like it's something that we want to do, right? It's much more fun to spend money, or maybe if you're so inclined, invest money. Like saving money is the most boring thing you can really do with it. But it's actually, in a way, the most important thing you can do with it, right? The nature of investment is always that it's speculative, so risky, you might lose everything.
I was going to say, if saving money might be boring now, but in the future, it's really going to pay off.
And it's absolutely true of sleep. The idea of a beauty sleep, right, I think is a really important example of that if you want to look youthful, if you want to look youthful long term, then you need to be able to sleep enough. And so I think there's this kind of thing about pushing through sleep, that it's pushing through lack of sleep, that there's kind of heroism to it. So many different stories I've seen over the years in all mediums. The hero is always, oh, I've only had a few hours sleep and, and I'm doing fine, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's true. In an emergency or in a crisis, right? In a war, in a fire or something like that, in a hospital, maybe in an emergency room, there is a certain amount of heroism of, I've barely slept, right? Because it's an emergency situation. But of course, emergency situations are draining and they should not be your everyday life. And what I see is a lot of people living their everyday life as if it's an emergency situation. When I look at their biochemistry, right? Sky high levels of, cortisol and adrenal chemicals and stuff like that. So getting enough sleep is really, I would say, the most important thing you can do, which, as you say, is completely free.
Beautiful. I mean, we've also done another episode that goes into sleep a lot more in detail, especially if you are someone that is struggling with getting sleep. So make sure that you do check out that episode. But I love that this one is the first on your list, Elwin, because sleep has been a little bit of an issue for me over my years and things like that. But after getting a really restorative night's sleep and understanding the value that has, I don't want to go back.
Absolutely. And I think everyone knows this in terms of their practical experience, right? No matter what amount of sleep you're used to, if it's, 5, 6, 7 hours, when you get less than that, let's say 1 or 2 hours less than that, you absolutely will feel it, right? And a lot of people are used to overriding that feeling, right? And because they have to in many cases, right? You have to go to work, you can get fired, you have to bring your kids to school, otherwise that's going to be trouble. I understand that there's a practical reason for it most of the time. But I think we have to realize that, okay, sometimes stuff happens and we just have to deal with it, but not to become used to that as a new normal. So that's what I mean by daily habits. With all these daily habits, I think we should be focusing on getting enough sleep. And for most people, we talk about this, as you say, in detail on the sleep episode. There's a very, very small minority of people genetically who genuinely thrive on 5 or 6 hours. But the vast majority of people, according to Matthew Walker, who's probably the scientist who's done the most research into sleep, is 7 to 8 hours. And that's when you're healthy. I just want to point that out as well. When you're ill, whether you've got an acute illness, you've got a cold or something more serious, or whether you've got a chronic illness as well, which so many people who are watching this kind of show probably do, whether it's a chronic autoimmune thing, whether it's chronic infection, chronic toxicity, whatever it may be, you may even need more. And there's this idea that anything above 8 hours in any given night is shameful.
So, I mean, that's a really good point. How can somebody tell if they've got enough sleep, if they're getting enough sleep?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would not base it on the amount of hours. That's the thing. I would base it on, first of all, do you wake up naturally? If you need an alarm clock to wake up, then it's not enough sleep. Again, I understand sometimes that's just life. That's just reality. Reality can be suboptimal. But I would aim for always waking up without an alarm clock, without, a person waking you up either, right? Just waking up naturally because you've had enough sleep. And that's the other sign of it. When you wake up, do you still feel tired? Now, obviously you do for a certain amount of time, but this really should only last, in my experience now, as someone who used to be exhausted and now largely isn't, a minute or two. If 5 minutes after waking up, you still feel sleepy, groggy, tired, anything like that, it's probably a sign you haven't had enough. Now, I realize, you may be watching this going, I know that, Elwin, I just find it so difficult to sleep enough, right? If you have insomnia, if you have problems getting to sleep, staying asleep, we go over that in great detail, how to deal with that in our sleep episode. But this is more just a reminder that if there's any day that you haven't had enough sleep, it is going to ruin the quality of your day to some degree. Of course, you can override it. Of course, if it's an emergency, you have to. But it's suboptimal. It's not going to help you to feel your best.
No, absolutely. And some of the things that I've been looking into recently, especially in the area of health, fitness, and losing weight, they also say that, not getting enough sleep or having a poor night's sleep severely impacts your hormones. And so that can be and have a knock-on effect, especially if somebody's like, oh, I'm just trying to lose weight. I'm doing everything right in the kitchen and at the gym. But if their sleep's out, then that could really offset them too.
Yeah, the number one factor that controls how you feel, at least day to day, is hormones. You can maybe say your childhood upbringing and genetics would control how you feel throughout your whole life in general. But how you feel day to day is absolutely down to hormones and the neurotransmitters that they often control. And absolutely, if you don't sleep enough, that whole hormonal balance is thrown off.
So yeah, so those that are out there going, yeah, I only got 2 hours of sleep. So, maybe that's not such a good thing for the future and your longevity. So that's a really great point. I'm glad that this was number one on your list, Elwin. So what is next on the most effective daily habits?
So a hugely important daily habit for health, and I think longevity as well, and I also think feeling good and emotional well-being and even productivity and success and stuff like that as well, it's very general, is walking. Now, you may have noticed, Chrissy, when I gave you notes for this a week or so ago, I just put in light exercise. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, no, I'm a big fan of light exercise. Whether it's Qigong, Tai Chi, gentle yoga, maybe light sports, all that kind of things. They're all fantastic. But there is something about walking which is very, very powerful and important in its own right. See, we're designed to walk, right? I believe that the general idea is that our ancestors throughout most of our evolution would walk 4 to 6 hours a day.
That's a lot.
It is a lot compared to what we do now.
Today. Yeah, absolutely.
I was just reading about Nietzsche's regular schedule of all things, the German philosopher of 19th century. And, he was a famous thinker, right? Maybe one of the top 10 most famous thinkers in the world. And he would walk that much, at least, if not more. And so there is that correlation between being able to think clearly and walking. If you have a problem, if there's something, or if you're upset, either way, so if you have an emotional blockage, if you have a mental blockage, one of the best things that you can do is walk. On the other side, I would say that not walking every day And I realize there may be, specific reasons why you can't on a given day. And there may be specific reasons why you can't for a period of time, right? If you break your ankle, you're going to have to
Of
stop
course.
walking for a bit, right? But I'm saying in general, with those, allowances, you should be aiming to walk every day no matter what. And I would say at least 30 minutes. If you're very unfit and unhealthy, then very gentle walking is great, right? But I still think 30 minutes is reasonable. If, in most cases, if on the other hand, a lot of people, who I know are more, into fitness and optimizing and stuff, and they would say the opposite, like walking is boring, right? Like they want to do something else. They want to run, jog, lift weights, whatever else, all of which are good things to do. I'm going to do them in a separate episode, which is, not daily habits, because you don't necessarily want to do heavy, intense exercise daily, but you
No,
definitely want
absolutely
to,
not.
yeah, but you want to walk daily. So I would say for those who find walking boring, one of the ways that you can up it in a very natural way is just walk up and down the hill. And of course, if you live in a hilly area and you can just walk up and down hills the whole time, great. But if, that's not an option, or if you don't even have a hill nearby, a slope, like any degree of incline, but it's still a completely natural movement, right? Like there's also cross trainer and all, kinds of things at the gym, stepping machine. But again, I'm not against any of those kind of things, but it's not a completely natural movement like walking is. And actually, I don't put the treadmill in this category when I'm saying walking. I'm really talking about walking. And if you can't go outside because you're in a really dangerous city or full of smog or whatever, I don't know, even just walking around your house. So another example, so I like to dedicate at least half an hour a day to just walking full stop. But another way that I like to walk is when I'm on the phone. If I'm on the phone and I don't specifically in that moment have to be in front of a screen because I'm typing something or looking at something, then I'll be walking. When I do calls with you often, Chrissy, I'll be like, right, I'm going to get off the phone, get off the computer, get onto my phone so I can walk around while we're talking. Like
I know.
literally.
That's always amazed me because I'm such a note taker as well. I'm like, how is he doing that? Like, what's happening? But that, you opened my eyes to that. I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't have to be just at the desk all the time. So that was very helpful. And then also, too, like I'll credit my mom and dad with this. They had these pedometer watches that were helping them. And when I was like, oh, that sounds like a really great idea. I'll get one. Because of the last few years, my job has definitely been more at a desk. And I was tracking it and I was shocked how little I was moving in a day. And so that was like a very big eye opener because, growing up, I was an athlete, all of that, and kids were little, moving constantly. And what I realized was, wow, I'm really becoming a lot more sedentary these past few years. And that's not helpful.
Yes, and I've given other, recommendations for walking, but another other benefits for walking. But another one that I'll throw in is it's hugely beneficial for the digestive system. Like your digestion is so much better if you walk, especially if it's a couple of hours a day. It's completely different, I would say. It's also really beneficial for sleep. A lot of people with insomnia, what the issue is they just haven't physically moved their body enough. That's not always the issue, but it's a really good start to assume that might be the case. Now, again, vigorous exercise, say an hour before sleep, is often considered a bad idea, right? Not
Well, why is that?
necessarily
Is
always.
it because you're raising your stress hormones or stress chemicals?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not some people can't, clear those stress chemicals very quickly, so it's not always a great idea. But a casual, whatever casual is for you, walk, say, less than an hour before you sleep. That can work just fine. So that's another potential benefit. But walking as soon as you wake up will still help you sleep better the next night. It doesn't have to be just before sleep.
Yeah, one of the ways I've kind of worked in walking was after I have each meal, because that's 3 times a day, and plus I have dogs, so they need a walk as well. I was like, oh, I'll just time this great. So I'm doing 3 walks after breakfast, lunch, and dinner, getting those steps in. I'm out for probably about 15 minutes minimum, probably. So yeah, and I've set a target, and it's been going really great. I feel better. And I would say it definitely is helping with sleep.
Well, I like what you said. It's like getting a dog is a great way of kind of making it a mandatory thing to go and walk. So, So I'll tell you my history of this. So I did every type of exercise except for walking for many, many, many years. I did all kinds of weird things. I did normal things. I did running. I did weight training, and I did all kinds of other more esoteric things, and qigong, and etc. etc. Anyway, and then I started having these pain issues, and
Where was the pain that you were having?
different places, but some around the neck and this kind of area, trapezius, some around the rib cage, but that ended up being digestive, and then some around the lower back. And again, I'd say that's postural or lack of movement, which I'll get into. And so at some point, I went to see a craniosacral therapist, and this is early on, and he said to me, I can help you, but and he said, I want you to walk every day. And he actually told me a way of walking as well, which I'll describe in a sec. And he said, people who keep coming to see me but don't do this recommendation don't get better. And those who stop coming to see me but do this recommendation do get better. So he's basically saying that doing this was much more important than, the very therapy that he was offering and making a living doing. So I thought that was interesting. He obviously wasn't, selfishly motivated to say that. And so I was like, okay, I'll try it. And so the way that he recommended walking was in I want to say exaggerated, but here's the key thing. Making sure that your hips are moving back and forward, so not with stiff hips, and then also the same thing with the shoulders. So I'd kind of do it kind of exaggerated, so a little bit like this, So when you're walking along, when you're not, because a lot of people, they walk, but then they're kind of frozen, right? Their hips are frozen, the shoulders are frozen, and maybe their arms don't even move, right? And that is better than nothing, but it's not really going to have all the substantial benefits. So it's like, so to begin with, I recommend walking an exaggerated way where you kind of push with your buttocks on each step, which will help to make your hip swing, and then you're kind of like really aware of swinging your arms. And then after a while, of course, with everything that you do, you kind of stop paying attention, right? You get distracted by something you're thinking, something you see, or whatever. And then you'll start doing it less, right? Because you switch to doing it unconsciously. But if you try and really fully do it, then when you become unconscious, then you'll still do it, but probably a normal, reasonable amount. Whereas if you start off doing it normally, but then you become unconscious, you often freeze up. And so as a result of him recommending that, I started watching other people walking, and I was like, oh yeah. I mean, this is England. I don't know if different countries are different. I hear maybe Latin America is different, but certainly in white Western countries, you see people walking, and it's incredibly rigid, like it's incredibly frozen, and so there's some benefit to that still, cardiovascular and all the rest of it, but it's really limited.
What's the importance of the exaggeration in the walking?
To free it up, this is what I'm saying. So I'm saying most people walk very stiffly. So the exaggeration is just if you're to begin with, you're doing it like that, then, maybe when you're walking normally, you'll do it like that, right? Whereas most people, they're barely moving at all. And so it's just to free it up, basically. Like you're really swinging your arms to begin with, just to get used to it. And then, as I say, once you stop trying to do that and you stop paying attention, you'll still be swinging them, but you'll actually be swinging them an optimal amount rather than a crazy amount. And same with the hip swinging kind of process as well. So as a result of doing that regularly, all those aches and pains goes away. And I will not say that I have been super good with this, because sometimes, I'm in England, it rains a lot. So I can tell you, as soon as I stop walking for enough days in a row, these kind of aches and pains creep back. And this is kind of minor stuff for me, but it can be quite serious. Like I had a client who was talking about, vein issues, thrombosis and swelling and gout and all kinds of issues. And, I was asking lots of questions. Typical me, I go into all this biochemistry and, test results and stuff like that. And then I was like, just came out to me and I was like, how much do you walk and exercise? Like, oh, I don't. And this is someone who worked in front of a computer all day, but they were taking calls. So in reality, most of the time they could have been up walking around. And that's what I pointed out to them. I said, you can just get up. And I realized, you're in a small apartment room. Like my office that I'm in now is not very big at all either. you can just walk back and forth, pacing, right? 2 steps one way, 2 steps back, or just a little stoical. Like that's totally fine. But still, and try and do it in that exaggerated way to begin with, just to kind of free things up. If you hate the idea of doing it in an exaggerated way, the other thing is, you can shake for a few minutes beforehand to really free it up. But it's really kind of practicing the swing that I'm talking about. That's kind of why I recommend the exaggerated thing, like was recommended to me, just to get into the swinging of the hips and the swinging of the shoulders back and forth.
No, that makes sense. You're getting the joints moving, and then within that articulation of the joints, then the fluids are moving about and kind of oiling everything up and getting it lubricated. I was going to ask that, let's say that there is somebody that potentially has some difficulty with movement, or there's a lot of people out there that have plantar fasciitis where it's painful for them to walk. What would somebody potentially do if there's some restriction for them?
Well, obviously resolve the restriction if it's serious. We talked about that in the chronic pain episode. But the advice that I would actually give for that is kind of crazy. Oh, yeah, that's another area of pain I didn't mention earlier. But it's actually walk. So if it's painful to walk, then walk. Now, obviously, you have to know, first of all, don't overdo it, right? Don't push through the pain to any considerable degree. But I'll give you an example of this. So one of the other areas where I used to get pain is on my right ankle. And so what I noticed is if I didn't walk for a while and then I started walking, my right ankle would hurt. And so my natural inclination, I think most people have a version of this when they don't walk and then they start, especially if they don't do any other exercise. But then when I just carried on walking, after a week or something, that pain would go away. So obviously, if it just gets worse and worse and worse, but if it gets worse and worse and worse, you need to find out what's going on, right? You need to go to a doctor, you need to go to a osteopath or a physical therapist, or any of the alternative things that I recommend in the chronic pain thing. But you need to actually work out what is going on. But a lot of the time, those aches and pains that show up when you first start exercising, they are more serious if you're doing really intense exercise. If you're lifting weights and stuff, you have to be careful. But with walking, it's pretty safe. It's pretty safe to just push through that discomfort. That's what I would do. In many cases, I would actually just walk, maybe not like double the amount of time you're walking. I don't mean that, but I mean, keep walking. Do it every day and see if it just goes away.
Good advice. Good advice. So, Elwin, what is next on our most effective daily habits?
So a daily habit that I highly recommend to feel youthful and vital, as well as really for mental clarity and staying calm and being able to appreciate life, there's a lot to it, is doing meditation. At least 20 minutes a day. 20 minutes is what's often recommended. I have done a lot of experimentation in this regard, and I can tell you 10 minutes is definitely better than 0 minutes. But there is something that seems to happen between the 10 and 20 minute mark where your brain really, in my experience, the brainwave shift. So there's the beta brainwave, which is your everyday thinking consciousness. And there's the high beta, which is stressed, mid beta, which is just normal, and then low beta, which is calm, but still thinking rationally. And then there's the alpha state, which is the dream state. And then there is the theta state, which is the borderline unconscious state. And then there's the delta state, which is deep unconsciousness. So that's kind of the journey down. I started from the highest frequency to the lower frequency. And so we all go all the way to delta at least once a day, and that's called sleeping. And that's the first piece of advice I've given for daily habits. But it's actually really beneficial to do that dip into delta, or at least theta, more than once a day, more than just sleep. And it's good to do that during meditation. I originally wrote down 2 times 20 minutes a day meditation, but I know that is going to be pushing it for a lot of people.
For some people, that might be a stretch. Yeah, for sure.
But at least just once a day to meditate. Now, I will give a couple of alternatives to that. I've said for many, many years, telling someone to meditate who has really high levels of cortisol and low GABA is cruel because it's just impossible. It's really not possible. So there are alternatives.
Because they can't stop the thoughts going. It's very difficult for their brain to settle.
Yeah, and in fact, it actually get worse. So an already agitated, irritated, overstimulated brain will actually get more at the attempt of quietening it down when you have that tendency to be in that high beta stress state. Um, yeah, let me just talk about one more benefit before I talk about like the practicalities. Here's another benefit that I don't see people talking about with meditation that I want to touch upon. Dopamine is super, super important. Dopamine is generally what makes us feel good. It's the energized version of feeling good anyway, which is the type of feeling good that most people like. The relaxed feeling good is generally not as sought after. So it's what most people would think of as feeling good. Now, here's the thing. In our culture, in our society, especially with modern technology, we're absolutely flooded with things that stimulate dopamine. We've talked about this in detail on the episode about addiction, which I highly recommend. You know, there's shopping, and there's drugs, and there's porn, and there's gambling, and there's social media, and there's media, and on and on and on. We all have access to all of that stuff 24 hours a day, and most of us find it very hard to resist it, right? At least to resist it 24 hours a day, even if we resist it some of the day, especially in our off time and downtime, right? A lot of people, when they have downtime, what they'll do with that downtime is consume media or do those other things that I just talked about, which are actually just more stimulation. So it's not really downtime in the sense of what I'm talking about, going from beta to alpha to theta, not that kind of downtime.
Right.
It's more like some pleasure, right? Which I understand. If you've got a miserable life and you struggle, if life feels like a struggle to you, you want to enjoy yourself when you have a bit of time to yourself. I understand that. So you go on social media or you go shopping or whatever. But the challenge of all that is it's stimulating dopamine even more. And when you stimulate dopamine, dopamine downregulates, meaning your body doesn't like you to have too much dopamine. And so when you do things to stimulate dopamine, it just downregulates how much dopamine you have. It downregulates the receptors. So basically, it keeps it at a certain bandwidth.
Why does the body not like you to have too much of that, of dopamine?
Well, it's still an excitatory chemical, so it's still using up more energy. The intense joy that you get from very high levels of dopamine,
It's expensive.
yes, come at a high energetic cost, which is why when you see people who really milk dopamine, and methamphetamine addicts is the classic example of that, you can see they're just kind of hollowed out, right? It just uses up all your nutrition at a really accelerated rate. There's not something about methamphetamine that is particularly poisonous that should destroy people at the rate that it does. The challenge that I understand really is that it stimulates so much dopamine that, I mean, that's why it feels so great. You're full of energy, you're full of, good feeling, you're full of pleasure, but that's using up all your reserves of nutrients. It's burning through your reserves, really as simple as that. And it's depleting you. So your body doesn't want that to happen. Now, here's the thing. Your body is kind of tuned to survive. And so it's much more tolerant of high levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline because, yes, it is burning through your reserves. But if you have high levels of adrenaline, it assumes that it's because you need it to survive. So it's acceptable. But dopamine is not a necessary to survive chemical. Dopamine is more a, thriving chemical, right? So it's reproduction, which is a luxury extra in most situations. Sometimes nature prioritizes, reproduction over survival, but usually it prioritizes survival. And so, dopamine might be, looking for food or whatever. But again, it's looking for food because I want it versus looking for food because I'm starving, right? Looking for food because I'm starving is an adrenaline activity. Looking for something because I want it is a dopamine activity. So desire is a luxury from a survival point of view. I guess that's the simple answer. And dopamine really is the neurochemical of desire. So your body downregulates it.
So what is the problem with being overstimulated?
So other than the depletion of your reserves that we've talked about, the other main issue is that what it takes to stimulate dopamine in you becomes more. And that's what they call tolerance. So for instance, while spending time with your loved ones may be very exciting compared to being on your own, it's not very exciting compared to whatever your favorite dopamine stimulation is, whether it's gambling or shopping or, drugs or whatever, right? So by overstimulating yourself with all the fake dopamine, cheap dopamine, I think they often call it these days, you lose the feeling of dopamine from everyday things. So suddenly a sunset is no big deal. Suddenly spending time with your children is, not as interesting as it could be, or loved ones. Your work is not as interesting. If you're in a business, then, going out and getting customers or whatever you need to do is not as interesting. It's not as interesting as the thing that gives you cheap, immediate dopamine. So this is the problem, and there's a whole community of people talking about this. It's big, but what I see a lot of recommendations to cut out the cheap dopamine sources. But the truth is, everything is stimulating to some degree or another. So to me, the best thing, and I have this tendency, absolutely, dopamine addict type of person. So the best thing for me is that I find is to do like a mindfulness meditation, where basically, now some people call it a meditation when they listen to like a guided audio thing. I actually would call that self-hypnosis. I understand why most people sell that as meditation, because hypnosis as a word has got a bad rap. So people think of it as bad. I see self-hypnosis as a very good thing. So I'm a big supporter of guided meditation things, but really it's hypnosis. What to me meditation is actually, the very definition is cutting out all or almost all outside stimulus. So the sounds,
that makes sense. Yeah.
So shut your eyes, maybe even do an eye mask, right? Maybe earplugs or headphones or something like that. Not having other people around you, if you're sitting down, not having a pet in your lap, right? Just like every outside stimulus, get rid of that. So it's you on your own in a room, could be a bathroom if you don't have any other rooms, but just somewhere, right? Where there isn't other people around, and there's no phone, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no neighbors you can hear in the background, ideally, all of that stuff. So just minimal input. And when you have minimal input, you're left with just you and your mind. And you want to try and also not get involved with your thoughts, right? That's the nature of meditation. So often the recommendation is just focus on your breathing, or just focus on the feeling of your body, or just focus on, and this is where sometimes there can be a little bit, right? To just focus on a mantra, just focus on repeating one sound over and over again. Or maybe, just focus on one image in front of you, something like that.
Right, like a candle flame or a small object or something like that.
Perfect. Yeah, candle flame is the typical thing, which is great. Yeah, absolutely. That's good. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, so that. So then it's just focus on one thing. So it's either focus on nothing or just focus on one thing. And what you'll find is, because you crave dopamine so much, that'll be extremely difficult. You'll be like, trying to stimulate yourself. You might be stimulating yourself. You might be, I'd like to buy this. It might be like positive stimulus, or it might be, oh God, this terrible thing's going to happen, right? It might be stress stimulus.
Got to go to the grocery store, get dinner, what's on the list?
Yes. Yeah, and for productive people like yourself, it's all, what do I need to do? Absolutely. And so then when that happens, then every time you let the thought go and you return back to whatever you're meant to be focusing on, your breath, your body, the candle, flame, whatever. And by doing that, you do a mini reset of your dopamine. So this is like a dopamine cleanse. You get rid of all the cheap dopamine, not necessarily out of your life, because it's very hard to cut out every single thing that I just said, especially, if you do social media for your living, how do you cut out social media, etc. But you can at least do 20 minutes of absolutely zero input, right? Not even the good dopamine sources, not even the healthy dopamine sources, just none at all. And that does set those receptors, in my experience. And then you're less addictive, you're less compulsive, you're more able to be present.
That's a really good point that you're making about that dopamine reset, because we are constantly inundated, even just the text notifications or the notifications that are coming through the phone. I mean, like you said, they're hard to get away from. So what I'm hearing is that just doing that meditation 20 minutes a day, there's kind of that sweet spot somewhere in between, maybe 10 or 20 minutes, where that reset, that dopamine reset, can come back in and kind of wash away all those as you were calling it, those cheap dopamine hits that we've been accumulating or been used to.
Yeah, to some degree. I haven't seen the evidence around this. If anyone has, then please let me know. But I believe that when you do go to that brain state other than beta. I think dopamine is very much a beta brain state only thing. So as soon as you go into alpha and lower, ideally theta, then it massively reduces that dopaminergic activity, and I think that's what resets it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. All right. Okay. Another thing to add to the list. But also, too, I like your distinction because I have a very active brain. So, um, guided meditation was something that I always went to because then it was easier for me to just focus on the guided meditation. But I like what I'm hearing too from you of just taking that exercise as a focus, whether it's going to be breath or a candle flame or something like that. And because I remember as well from the addictions episode where we were talking about exercising that will part, that focus part to help with other things, the addictions and the compulsions especially.
Absolutely. I mean, in a way, will could almost be described as the ability to resist the temptation of getting distracted by dopamine or adrenaline stimulating stimuli, right? So basically, I can keep on track and do whatever I set my mind to because I'm able to resist that dopamine pleasure or that, adrenaline freak out. I can stay on track. That's so yeah, I really correlate them.
I'm loving this list so far, Elwin. Let's go. What's next on the most effective daily habits?
So a daily habit that is very effective for feeling good, but actually there's a lot of research around how it is profoundly beneficial, is focusing on what you have to be grateful for. This is a really difficult thing to do for most people. And I would say it's quite a difficult thing it has been quite a difficult thing for me to do throughout my life as well. Just as meditation is difficult because of the tendency to be tempted by stimulation, whether it's dopamine stimulation or adrenaline stimulation, gratitude is also difficult, but I would say for different reasons. So one of the things that leads to us being the most unhappy, I would say, is feeling either victimized or feeling resentful. These are some of the worst things that we can feel.
Where would you throw complaining into that? Because there's a lot of times where I do hear like whether you've got the constant complainer that's just and you're like, oh my goodness. Okay. Would that fall somewhere in that space as well?
Yeah, good question. I mean, complaining could be both. I'd say it's more tone. I'm not quite sure if I use the right word, but I guess by victim, I'm talking more about like the whiny kind of tone that we all have sometimes. The poor me, feel sorry for me, I feel sorry for myself, that kind of thing. Whereas the resentment is more the frustration, anger, bitterness. So you could complain like, nothing good ever happens to me. So then that's more resentful, or it's so easy for that person, it's not for me. That's resentful. Although you could say there's a shade of victim, whereas like, oh, nothing ever works for me, and no matter how hard I try, and that's more what I would call like that victim voice, right?
Yeah.
And it's a great question you ask because I would spot them much more by tone than content, But in either case, I really feel that the root of all unhappiness, and in fact, I would actually go beyond that. I would say evil is these things, is victimization and resentment, feeling that way. Now, here's the thing. The natural objection, of course, that will come up for people is, but I have the right to feel victimized. I have been victimized. Or I have the right to feel resentful. I have been hard done by, right? Life has been harder for me than other people. Life isn't fair. Life hasn't been fair to me. And I would say to all of that, yeah, I'm sure you're right. Life is unfair. I have definitely been victimized. I was abused throughout my childhood and, maybe through partly my own responsibility, a lot of my early adulthood as well. I had a lot of feelings to feel resentful. Look, I was full of feelings of victimization and resentment throughout most of my early life. I really understand it. And again, I feel like it was justified. And I feel like minimizing that feeling and saying, oh, you should be grateful. Other people have it worse. I'm not saying any of that. I 100% feel like you should honor the reality of however terrible your life has been, and not whitewash it, not minimize it, not sugarcoat it. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying 100% be honest with yourself and, if appropriate, other people about how terrible and unfair life is for you. However,
I
what I'm
love the
also saying,
however.
but I mean that. I'm not saying that just to placate those people, because it's totally unhealthy psychologically as well to lie and pretend and to have a facade. And this is what people do. And the most unhealthy and sick people, that's often what they do, right? Whether it's the schizophrenic living in a completely illusionary world, or it's the narcissistic having to constantly live up to this, idealized persona that isn't real. None of that's good, right? So absolutely, I think it's very, very good to admit and be honest about the terribleness of your life up until now, to the degree that it's true. But here's the thing. Focusing on that doesn't make you feel good. It absolutely...
Focusing on the victimization and the resentful feelings, though, that aspect, that's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, and maybe even the incidents, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with discussing it, maybe with a close friend when you're getting to know them, or family, or a therapeutic setting, or whatever. But if you're talking about horrible stuff that happened to you over and over again, especially if you find yourself telling every new person you meet, this is excessive focusing on trauma, which actually doesn't help to heal you. It just reinforces it. So, all right, there's two schools of thought on this, at least in the kind of mental health world, let's just say. And even beyond that, personal health, personal development, self-improvement, personal optimization, etc. You tend to see two schools of thought. One of them is don't focus on all that stuff. The more you focus on it, the more that you solidify those neural channels in your brain, the more every time the brain can't really tell the difference between something happening in your imagination and something happening in the real world. So every time that you remember a traumatic situation, which you will do to some degree by recounting one, you are going to
relive it in a way,
relive it and re-experience it in your body, and your body's going to be traumatized all over again.
Biochemically as well, right?
Yeah.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just need to take a moment to quickly tell you about a way that you can support the podcast by getting high quality, affordable supplements that Elwin and I personally use, and that's Feel Younger. What I love about Feel Younger is they have great quality products with minimal fillers, but the prices are very affordable. You can call their customer support team 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in my experience, they're really helpful and friendly. And what I love most of all is the amazing descriptions Elwin's written for each product category about that topic. There's so much information and education on it. I've actually learned more from reading their product descriptions than I have from most articles. So, to support the podcast, please use Feel Younger for all your supplement needs. And to let them know we sent you, you can use promo code RejuvenateMe for a 20% discount off your first order at feelyounger.net. That's 20% off your first order with promo code RejuvenateMe at feelyounger.net.
But there's the other side who says that when you ignore and avoid and refuse to, acknowledge that, in order to do that, you have to do a lot of editing and you have to do a lot of suppressing and repressing reality, both in terms of maybe the original situations, but also how you feel right now. Because, of course, when we have traumas, they are constantly brought up again where they're, the word triggered, right? So, someone did something to you. Every time someone does something vaguely similar, that feeling comes up all over again, right? And so ignoring that and pretending it's not the case doesn't work. That's the other school of thought. It just leads to, very often, in fact, what it leads to is sickness and ill health in the body. I kind of believe that both are right. And that's the tricky thing. It is true that the more you focus on it, the more that you create upset and trauma in your body. And it is true that the energy required to repress it and suppress it and ignore it is considerable. And it also means you're not resolving the issue. And so that's why I'm saying what I'm saying. by all means, deal with it in a therapeutic setting with a loved one, talk about it, be fully open, right? But don't think about it all day, every day. Don't talk about it all day, every day. And the alternative I'm suggesting is also focus on what you're grateful for. One can be turned into another. I gave an example of this, I think, on a recent episode. I can't remember what, but there's like an alchemy that almost can be done of turning lead into gold, where every time you have a horrible experience, painful, upsetting, whatever it can be, whatever it may be, ask yourself, what good can I find in this? So that's a version of what is there to be grateful for. And I'll give an example with me. Every time I have a health thing come up now, I'm like, well, I'm going to learn about how to deal with it, and then I can share it with lots of other people, right? So there's like a benefit to it. And I can say, you know what, I'm actually grateful to have these challenges because it gives me an opportunity to overcome them. Or if it happens to someone I care about, really the same thing. I mean, obviously I don't say to them, I'm grateful that you've got this issue, but rather than me feeling sad in myself that they've got it, I can just go, you know what, it's an opportunity for everyone to learn and grow and all the rest of it, right? So focusing on what you have to be grateful for, I'm not saying as a tool to repress whatever painful feelings. I'm saying also do that and try and do it a lot. Try and do it throughout the day, but at least I would recommend, aiming to have a specific time that you do it once a day. And I would recommend that you do it when it's easiest, not when it's the most difficult.
Yeah, I was going to ask you for like, how would you do it? Especially if there's somebody that obviously has got some deep, deep, deep trauma. Yet, okay, of course they've got a roof over their head, they've got things like that, but how can they really get to that point of expressing gratitude for what they have, where it's an easy space like you're just describing?
Almost everyone feels kind of happy at least some of the time in a specific context, right? So for a lot of people, it's like when they eat, For other people, it may be something less wholesome, right? When they drink alcohol or whatever. I'm saying I'm not like, it could be indulging in any of the addictions and vices that we talked about earlier. I'm not saying that I endorse any of that stuff. I'm saying if you do it anyway and it leaves you feeling even a bit happy, that's the time to start focusing on what else you're grateful for, right? So, you've just done some shopping, maybe you spent some money and you don't, you realize you hadn't, but you are looking forward to those shoes or whatever is on its way, right? So it's like, okay, well, I'm grateful that I can afford those shoes. I'm really looking forward to them. Okay, well, what else am I grateful for? And you can start with, well, my other shoes and my other clothes. And do you know what I mean? Whatever's natural, or maybe, the highlight of maybe you live a horrible, lonely life by your comparison, but once a day someone comes and brings you meals. And so that's your favorite part of the day and you're happy then. So immediately after they leave, while you're still feeling happy about that, before you go back to feeling lonely, what else are you
That's a
grateful
good
for
point
other than that
to do it.
person?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like building off the momentum of that initial,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I would not recommend the opposite approach, which is, wait until you're in the pit of victimhood and, feeling despair or, rage and resentment and then try and shift into. You could do as a thought experiment, but I would not be surprised if it's not successful. I would say with gratitude, my recommendation is really to make it easy. Now, that does remind me of one other recommendation that I've seen, which is that I saw some research around this. I can't remember who did it, but they said that generally people are not good at this. I don't know if they were doing the technique that I just recommended. I think they were just, in a study setting, just telling people to focus on things they're grateful for. But when they looked at the effect on their brain, it was pretty minimal, probably for reasons we talked about earlier. It's very hard to create gratitude in yourself from nothing. And so another recommendation is actually to watch people or even listen or read stories of people who are really helped by others in a benevolent way. And others, I think, is what was recommended there, but I don't see why it'd be limited to that. It could be stories about people being helped by a divine force. I think that works just as well, by God or whatever. But basically where people have this benevolent force and then they feel grateful. And so watching is obviously the most impactful. So if you watch people who have this amazing thing happen to them that give them a reason to feel grateful, you feel grateful as well. So that's the kind of mirror neurons theory. So that's another way of doing it.
When you were just saying that, that brought up a point. I have to go to the airport a lot of dropping off, but a lot of picking up. And obviously, the dropping off tends to be a little sad. But see, going to the airport when it's pickup time, and you can see people like running down, like, oh my gosh, they're so excited to see each other. When I see that, I can't but help feel some elation, some joy through that mirroring. It's really quite uplifting.
Yeah, that's more of a joy one. It's not particularly easy to find gratitude. As I said, you really want to look for maybe inspirational stories. Especially, it's the act of being helped by something. That's the thing that triggered gratitude. As I said, something, I don't want to limit it to only other people. You could feel helped by, I don't know, nature, animals, God, whatever. But feeling like, because that's the key thing, right? If it's something. What is gratitude? It's a feeling that there is something outside yourself that is benevolent towards you. I think that's what it very specifically is. It's beyond just happiness. And there's something about gratitude that, in my opinion, better than happiness. And I've seen studies about this as well, that gratitude is like one of the most healing things for the brain. That beyond just happiness and joy, beyond love, beyond lots of other things, it really melts resentment and victimhood. Because if you're in the middle of feeling like, wow, there's something who really loves me and is actively making my life better, it's really hard to feel that and resentful at the same time. Whereas you could feel really happy, and yet, it's not that far away to go to, but I'm still annoyed. I mean, I've certainly done it, right? 1 minute you feel happy, and then something hasn't gone your way, I go right back to resentfulness. I know I've been capable of that. It's quite hard to go from gratitude to resentful. It's because they're completely polar opposite.
Unless you stub your toe in the minute or you drop something on it. Yes.
Yeah, kind of. But even then, I feel like if you're really caught up in the gratitude, you are kind of in that mindset of like, oh, maybe that happened for a reason.
Yeah,
You know what I
that's
mean?
true.
Like
That is true.
you don't go fully into victimhood. You might. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think it's the most antithetical of all to that state of victimhood and resentment. So yeah, big fan of gratitude.
And then within the gratitude aspect, I mean, you talked a lot about, the process of doing it. Then what is going on internally biochemically that's bringing that benefit?
That's a good question. I don't believe it has been studied adequately in terms of the specific hormones and neurotransmitters that make you feel it. But what I strongly suspect is that it's oxytocin. That's the main feeling. And certainly, Joe Dispenza, an example, does gratitude meditation specifically. And he talks about people at a certain point of it being flooded by oxytocin. He also talks about how, and flooded meaning, not just twice as much as usual, but maybe 10, 100 times as much as usual, right? Just like this massive amount. And he talks about, like an anti-trauma, I can't remember the word he uses for it, but basically where you have an experience of gratitude and appreciation that's so intense that it kind of cancels out the trauma. So for instance, he talks about people who are like horrifically, kidnapped and raped and abused and all the rest of it, and then they have this experience, and at that moment they are so full of gratitude and so full of conviction of this benevolent force that is looking out for them and has their best interest at heart, that they actually feel grateful even for the trauma. They even feel grateful for the horrific things that have happened to them. And I have had those experiences too, personally. I can attest to this. Quite a few times I've had, what would often be called a spiritual or religious experience where you feel so incredibly good, which includes a lot of gratitude, that every single negative experience that has happened in your life feels like it's okay because it's all led to this moment. I think people often feel that as well when falling in love, right? At the intense level, you feel so, maybe all the bad relationships I've had are all good because they've led me to this person, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's a lot that gratitude can help with, and especially like as you just said, and what you've really explained here. I loved how you described it, that it's something outside of yourself that is acting benevolently towards you. That was a really great distinction, Owen. Really great. Beautiful, Elwin. So, what is next on our list of the most effective daily habits?
So one thing that I think is very important to do every day is, and I'll put these two together as one issue, build discipline every day and spend time doing what you love every day. And it's very, very important to be focusing on both, in my opinion, not one or the other. A certain personality type, especially those who are high in the trait of conscientiousness, will tend to focus much more on building discipline in one way or another. Maybe not building discipline, maybe they wouldn't call it that, but being organized, being productive, being industrious, I guess those are the key words for it. Being hardworking, being getting stuff done, and also making themselves there's value to that, of course, right? Society and civilization would crumble without those people and that perspective. And also your own quality of life is poor. Like a lot of when I look at people who are healthy, what I see is the right balance of these two things. Without self-discipline, it's pretty much impossible to be healthy beyond, say, your 30s, unless you're exceptionally lucky genetically, because you're just going to be indulging in all kinds of things which are bad for you and not doing enough of the things that are good for you, right? This is pretty obvious. And there is a lot of qualities, like basically most of the qualities that people admire, if not all of them, come from self-discipline. And even things you wouldn't think of, like people admire people who are very intelligent or knowledgeable. There's a lot of discipline that leads to that. People admire beauty, and I see a lot of people, who have beauty by most standards, were like, oh, I was just lucky, I was just born that way. Beyond maybe a very young age, that's not true, right? Even if you're born with beauty, you can very easily ruin it with bad lifestyle. So, to maintain beauty beyond childhood, really, I would say, even up to the point of 18, right? By that stage, if you've been, taking drugs and eating loads of junk food and all the rest of it, you'll have ruined a substantial amount of beauty. So all these qualities that are considered success and beauty and intelligence and athletic performance and whatever, all of those things, popularity even, all of those things are absolutely dependent on discipline. Discipline is an absolutely crucial quality. However, too much discipline leads to rigidity, which can actually lead to all kinds of health problems. People who stick to all kinds of, say, diet regimes because they should, and then they actually miss all the cues coming from their body, and they actually create kind of problems. Health problems is something that I've done to myself. I've seen many other people around me do to themselves as well. So that's one thing. Another thing is when you push yourself very hard because you're focused on discipline and productivity and all the rest of it, you are not resting enough. You're not recovering enough. You're not recuperating enough. You're probably not spending time focusing on what you're grateful for, closing your mind with meditation, getting enough sleep, all that kind of stuff. So it's just too draining to be disciplined all the time. It's using up too much of your resources. So it's going to prematurely age you in that way as well. And then also, I would say that rigidity obviously leads to a lack of enjoyment of life. And what does that mean biochemically? It means, high cortisol, high noradrenaline, yes, high dopamine as well, but it's low levels of oxytocin. It's low levels probably of the endocannabinoids. It's low levels of the endorphins. It's low levels of GABA, probably most importantly out of those ones. So you're not actually enjoying yourself enough. And what happens to a body that has large amounts of cortisol and adrenaline and noradrenaline and not high enough levels of especially GABA? They're going to age prematurely, right? And so I really feel like focusing on spending every day, focusing on spending as much time of the day as possible, doing a fairly balanced amount of both of those. So the hardworking person tends to see any enjoyment as a waste of time, and therefore they're actually more likely to do the bad type of enjoyment because you can never be, completely balanced. So they're more likely to do the addictive types that we've already talked about. And then, of course, a easygoing, take life as I find it, free spirit type. Probably less likely to watch a podcast like this, to be honest. They're going to not have the discipline to do the things and not do the things which lead to more health and a longer life and all the rest of it. So it's the balance that's key, and spending as much of the day as possible doing one of those two things, as opposed to when you try and do too much of one or the other. I think that's when you're much more likely to get into addictive tendencies.
Agreed. I agree. Yeah, because I'm definitely more coming from the more conscientious side, getting things done. And what I've definitely realized is there's not enough play in my daily life. But also part of it is I don't know really what play is because I'm so focused on the other side of it that I haven't quite figured that part out. So if somebody's, if they're resonating with what I'm saying, how would somebody go about figuring out like what is that? Because totally agree, it can go the other way into the more not so great ways of fun or play, as we've talked about in other episodes that maybe aren't really for your, to help you feel vital and youthful. They're having the opposite effect.
Yes, absolutely. That balance is very difficult. And so when you identify what you're more likely to do, as you just said, Chrissy, then I think the next step is to focus on the other one, right? So I'm like you. I tend to be, rigid and all the rest of it. Other warning signs that that's the case, by the way, if you find yourself judging other people a lot. I don't know if you do that, Chrissy. I know you're very, very nice and polite, but maybe inside
On
your
the
head you do
inside,
it.
I might be judging, silently.
Basically, if your life revolves around should, right? Now, some people's life revolves around should, but it's kind of rebelling against should. So I'm not talking about that. But if you're like the representative of should for yourself and other people, as I have been, then that is a classic sign to spend more time focusing on enjoying yourself. And conversely, if should to you is a thing that you want to keep away, right? If people are like, you should do this, and you're like, oh, get away from me, man, stop harshing my mellow, I know I'm being silly, but if that's if you have a kind of response to people trying to tell you what you should do, not because you don't want to hear it from other people, but just because you don't want to hear should, you just want to be free, you just want to enjoy yourself, then that's probably a great sign that focusing more on self-discipline is going to be the main thing that gets you to where you want to go.
Yeah, that's great. And then, as I was saying before, if somebody's trying to figure out what is fun for them or what that other side of the balance would be, how would somebody go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's two elements of what I meant by the enjoyment. So there is a productive enjoyment, right? And so generally, this type is much more comfortable about that, right? So meaning they might go from doing a job that they have to doing a job that they enjoy, but they're still working, right? Or they do a hobby, like one of my friends is a classic example of this. Like even in his off time, every single thing that he would do would be productive in some way. Like he would go and play golf or something, which can be a fun play activity, but then he'd have a coach like helping him to be as good as possible. I'm like, this is like this. I mean, it's fine, and he enjoyed it, so that's still good, right? But it's in the it's still on the discipline, organized side of things, right? Whereas I would say the thing that makes play is not just that you enjoy it, but also that you're relaxed, right? That there's no sense of should. And so to answer your question, I would say before you can do play, you first of all have to be able to relax. That's the first stage. And and then when this is true in general, but it's also true day by day, right? So if you go from, oh, I've got to get this done, I'm so worried about this, should this, you can't then go straight to play because it's a completely opposite state. So the first thing you would probably do is go into relax. And then once you're relaxed, maybe you're doing meditation like we talked about earlier or whatever. And then once you're relaxed, then you can go more into, okay, now let me do something more active. What would be fun? You know, what would be enjoyable? But I don't think you can skip between the two extremes. I think you have to go to relaxed in between.
No, that makes sense. I mean, this is a really, really, really good yeah, the balance between the self-discipline and then doing something that you love. I mean, what I'm hearing is, the harmony in that balance really brings that harmony and balance to your being. So that's why it's really an effective habit that we should bring into our lives on a daily basis.
100%. And I would also add, if you really crack it in general, and I'm not saying I have, but the days that I have, because this is a day by day thing, right? You're much more likely to be in a flow state. And a flow state is the best possible state, and that could be a state of flow while you are achieving things, or it could be a state of flow while you're messing around and playing. Right, either case, because to me, a flow state is really a balance of those two forces, maybe called yin and yang, which I neurochemically relate to dopamine and GABA. Right, dopamine is the I want to do stuff, and then GABA is I'm relaxed and I'm good just as I am. I don't need to do anything. Right. And so if you manage to do that magic balance, if you're like, I'm good just as I am, but I also would enjoy this, that is kind of the state of flow in a nutshell. So the play thing is more on the GABA end of it, where it's mainly just relaxing. And then the maybe, highly productive but enjoyable work is more on the dopamine side. But kind of going between those two is ideal. Whereas most of us tend to spend a lot of time on one and the other and not the opposite, as you said.
Yeah, that makes absolute total sense. Bring on the flow state, please. Yes, I'll have that. Wonderful, Elwin. So, what is next on our list of the most effective daily habits?
A daily habit which I find to be very valuable and important for feeling healthy and vital, that becomes actually more and more important as you get older, especially, is challenging yourself the right amount every day.
And when you say challenge, I was just sorry to interrupt. When you say challenge, what do you mean specifically by challenge?
So challenge being difficulty. So when life is too easy, when the life that, and again, I'm not talking about in general. You may have achieved amazing things, gone through terrible hardships, but I'm saying today, when today is too easy, we tend to stagnate. There's not enough dopamine, there's not enough excitement, there's not enough enthusiasm. When we have too much challenge, we tend to go into overwhelm. Talking about adrenaline and noradrenaline especially is my understanding of it. And so generally, I think most people would prefer to be in a state of complacency and stagnation than overwhelm. Overwhelm feels not fun, right? And so when you start off in life, kind of everything is overwhelming, not necessarily in a bad way, right? Like when you're a baby, like, what is this? And, when you're a child and you're walking around, like everything is like, wow, what's that? It's like everything is very exciting, which is why kids can be so fun to be around, but also they're quite close to overwhelm, right? This is why they have to be carefully managed and nurtured and soothed and all the rest of it, because, there's so much that could overwhelm them if they were not taken care of and protected. Now, as adults, we don't have anyone to do that for us, right? To soothe us and manage us and all the rest of it, so we have to do it for ourselves, and hopefully we've learned to do that. But here's the thing, because most of us, our tendency is towards like safety, which is understandable, will tend to fall on the side of satiety and therefore stagnation if we can get away with it. And that's why, there's sayings like like one of them is hard times create strong people create good times create weak people, and weak people create hard times. That's kind of like one example of that cycle. So if you're familiar with that, right, Chrissy?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense as well. I totally get it.
So the idea that strong people create good times, great, but why would good times create weak people, right? So that's the question I'm talking about here. And the reason would be because when times are good, so in other words, easy, and in many ways, although life is really awful, especially at the moment in many ways, and you could, you could dedicate not just a podcast episode, but a whole endless stream of episodes about how bad life is, and it would all be true. So despite all that being the case, there's also a lot of ways that life is very easy compared to how it used to be. mainly through technology, and also I'd say sociological things. And so just getting food used to be a massive struggle throughout most of our evolution. Just not dying of cold, depending on your environment, or heat, depending on your environment, used to be a massive struggle. Just not dying of thirst used to be a massive struggle. Just not dying of violent death used to be a massive struggle. So all of these things now are so much easier than they used to be, even though a few of us still struggle with a few of those things, but it's very, much less of the population, and it's much easier to deal with. And so in many ways, our life is very easy. And we are built for challenge. But of course, not too much. And so that, and this is, as I say, I wouldn't think of this in terms of a lifetime. As you may have really overcome tremendous adversity, but this is where often, another cliche is the idea that success is a curse, right? When you're really successful, when you reach the top of the mountain or whatever mountain you've been aiming for, it's so easy to become complacent. And complacency isn't just bad for your spirit, or your moral or spiritual or psychological health even. I would say it's bad for you physically, for the reasons that we're talking about. If you stagnate, if things are too easy, then you're not going to be challenging yourself. And when you're not challenging yourself, you start to atrophy. And
There's no growth, right? I mean, you're not moving forward.
Absolutely. So that, as much as we talked about the dangers of excess dopamine, there is also the danger of deficiency of dopamine as well. And so it's really the impact on the brain that is the most. There's a lot of research showing that when the brain is not sufficiently challenged, it starts to atrophy. And so that's where you'll tend to see it. It won't generally overwhelm, and some of the other issues we talked about will show up more in the body, like as in, what people think of as the body. I know brain's part of the body, but it's the stagnation will show up more, or the lack of challenge will show up more in the brain. And so that's one of the recommendations that's often given to people, especially as they get older, to keep themselves feeling younger, is to challenge themselves mentally, obviously, as we've already talked about. But I would broaden it. I would say challenge yourself physically, like we've talked about with exercise and stuff like that. There's a lot of evidence that shows that people who do even intense exercise, like resistance training and stuff, up into their 60s, 70s, 80s even, are healthier and live longer lives. So there's the physical challenge to the body. And I would even say emotional, psychological challenge. Just because you're 40 now, 60 now, 80 now, doesn't mean that you can't put yourself outside your comfort zone, meet new people, have new experiences, go to new places. All of that stuff absolutely helps to keep you feeling young.
We're going to take a quick break to share with you one of our amazing sponsors, Genetic Insights. What makes Genetic Insights uniquely valuable is that they test over 83 million different variants, which guarantees a 99.7% accuracy on all of their DNA reports. With over 100 reports available, you get comprehensive insights into what your DNA is telling you about how to optimize your health today and in the future. I found reviewing my results to be incredibly accurate and applying some of the recommendations, which are personalized to your individual DNA, to be extremely helpful for me and my family. I also loved how easy it was to upload my raw DNA data that I already had from previously using Ancestry.com, because Genetic Insights supports uploading raw data from all major platforms. To get your health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and get 20% off today by using coupon code Rejuvenate. Remember that supporting our sponsors supports our podcast, which allows us to keep sharing this important information with you free of cost. So, go get your Genetic Insights health reports by going to geneticinsights.co and use coupon code Rejuvenate for 20% off today. That's a really good point, because I do see, and especially this happened a lot after COVID, where especially anyone that was sick was not told to leave their house. They weren't outside. They weren't getting those experiences. They weren't expanding in that way. So those, and even though that might have been minuscule challenges, by not having that, I saw a lot of deterioration.
Absolutely. And I've had that as well. One way I used to challenge myself is to travel a lot. and I've done way less for various reasons in the last couple of years, and I'm aware of that. So I try and challenge myself in different ways to make up for that. Another type of challenge that I will just mention before we go to the next thing is challenge of the extremes, right? So I mentioned meditation earlier as a almost kind of sensory deprivation exercise. So, having literally no input from the outside world when you're usually inundated with input is kind of extreme. It feels extreme, right? It feels weird if you're not used to doing meditation. Breath work is another example that can feel extreme. Holding your breath in or out for a long period of time feels pretty extreme. Cold water exposure feels pretty extreme. So as much as stress chemicals chronically elevated is absolutely not good and prematurely aging, to temporarily spike stress chemicals, there's a lot of evidence to show that that's actually very beneficial. So that's part of it as well, that doing those things that are really intense for brief periods of time, so we don't want stress all day, but for brief periods of time, getting into cold water for a few minutes, doing the breathing practice for a few minutes where you do a breath hold that really stimulates the stress chemicals. As I say, like cutting out all kind of input is another example of that. I mentioned those because you can do those on your own for no money whenever you want, right? But if there are other versions of that, if it's traveling to a different country, if it's going to a new group and meeting new people, all those kind of things tend to, get the juices flowing, as it were, get the stress chemicals running. And that's not a bad thing as long as it's not chronic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then I also wanted to ask within that, for somebody that may, and maybe this is going off track a little bit, but somebody that may be worried about that stagnation in the brain or thinking about maybe Alzheimer's or things like that, are there any kind of challenging game? I know there are games, we're still on a device or something like that, or things that can get the brain flowing and that cognition activating in a way, because let's say they can't go out, they can't do certain things, they might be restricted still. Are there things that they can do that is challenging in the way you're describing?
Yes. I would say your best friend when it comes to this challenge is curiosity. So I would say follow the thread of curiosity. Now, this is hard for some people. Some people have really had curiosity crushed in them by their upbringing, which is very unfortunate. So I realize it's more difficult for some than others, but really, I would say search for that, dig for that, and follow that golden thread of whatever you're even mildly, vaguely curious about. And then, of course, beyond that, it's learning new things and having new experiences. So as you said, if they can't leave the house or whatever, maybe they're disabled, there is that value of going on the internet or TV or whatever, right? Like learn something. You can learn pretty much anything these days, right? Even if you're housebound, you can learn to, I don't know, redo your whole house. You can learn to, create an indoor, garden with plants and grow your own vegetables in your windowsill, like all that kind of stuff. Like whatever you're into, learning something new. And of course, again, if you're watching this podcast, you're ready, at least, you're interested in learning about health, which is why you're here. But learning something new, meaning it's good to specialize in things because it means you can develop, expertise, which you can help other people with. But it's also good, whatever that may be, right? Even if, the thing that you're an expert in is, I don't know, comic books or fishing or whatever. Like it doesn't have to be something that necessarily helps people, but just, it's fun to really deep dive in something and then you're the expert and you can help others understand that thing. But the other thing that's fun is to learn something new that's not in your comfort zone. That's not the thing that you would normally do. I believe that that's what the research shows, that that's really the thing that gets that neurogenesis going, gets the new brain cells, the new neural pathways. On a what you do level is that exposing yourself to new experiences, so new people, new places. Now, in terms of the learning something new, I'll tell you what the biggest stumbling block to that is this. When you first start doing something new, it generally doesn't feel good because you're not good at it. Some people are definitely better at that than others, but like learning to be comfortable with not knowing, learning to be comfortable with being a novice, to not being good at something, is a really key facet to this. It's very hard to, challenge yourself if you feel like you already have to be perfect, which is a specific psychological tendency that quite a lot of people have. That's certainly not unusual. Or if you're very concerned with what other people think of you, if you're doing this, let's say, not on your own, and then you have to be okay with other people around you being better than you at this thing or knowing more than you at this thing or whatever. So it goes back to the quality that we discussed in the episode Narcissism, which is humility, right? If you approach the challenge, if you approach the learning with humility, that makes it infinitely easier for it to be successful. So, and of course, this is reasonable, right? I mean, if you've been doing something a long, long time and you're no good at it, then it might be fair to criticize you, but who would expect you to be good at something you just started at, right? You don't have to feel bad, but so many of us do feel bad at not being good at something, especially if there's other people watching, even if there's no reason why we would be good at it. And so overcoming that mental barrier, I would say, is key to this challenge. And again, it explains why most people don't, right? As I mentioned before, I think I used to work at a retirement home with very old people. I think the average age was 89. And they were the healthiest people. It wasn't a care home. So these were people who lived independently largely. And I did observe that, so as people get older, they are less open. But I did observe that they would try and do new things, certainly more than the average person. I did notice that. They would try and make sure to go out, even if it was very difficult and they were moving, very, very slowly and stuff like that. They would be curious. They would come up to me and ask me questions. I really think that is part of keeping your mind young.
Yeah, keeping that spark. So the benefits outweigh for sure. So don't give up. I think that's the real thing here. Don't give up no matter what. Keep going. Keep going. So Elwin, this is wonderful. What is next on our list of the most effective daily habits?
So this is fantastic for your psychological health and also your relationships. And a lot of studies have shown that relationships are the main determinant to how happy you are. And of course, how happy you feel is a crucial determinant to how long you live and how healthy you are. So indirectly, I think this is huge. So my recommendation to focus on every day is do at least one thing to make yourself happy without indulging any guilt. And at least one thing every day to make someone else happy.
Ooh, that's a key point.
without expecting anything in return. Now, most people will feel comfortable with at least one of those things, but I'd also say most people will struggle to do both. So I find there are some people who really focus on helping others, wanting to make other people happy, but they really struggle to make themselves happy, and they feel like they're being selfish and they feel guilty if they're doing it. The other type of person, the extreme of which is the narcissist, which we've talked about, is just fine doing things to make themselves happy. They don't feel any guilt or shame about it. But when they do things to make other people happy, they always have an agenda in mind. It's always for a reason, so they can get something out of it, so they can get something back from the person. And so, you may not be a martyr or a narcissist, but most of us tend to fall a little bit more along one than the other. I'll be honest, for me, it was on the narcissist end of the spectrum. To be honest, I would not feel happy either when I was young. I would be neither. But if anything, I would do something to make myself happy rather than someone else. And so it's very important for me to, both work on making myself happy, but also making sure I do something for other people every day. This is one of the best recommendations as well for depression that I hear on a behavioral level rather than a biochemical level is if you're depressed, just focus on helping other people. A lot of people who are depressed, ironically, are very self-focused. And so getting out, and focused on their own victimhood, often their own misery, right? Which again may be completely valid, probably is, as I mentioned. So it's completely valid, but focusing on someone else and helping them to feel better often makes you feel happy too. So even though I've presented it as kind of opposite things, they should actually feed into each other, because here's the truth. When you make yourself happy, you are more of a pleasure to be around, and everyone other than the worst type of people will be happy because you're happy. right? There are a few people, maybe they're very jealous, they're very miserable, and they don't like it when you're happy. You don't want those people in your life. But they don't have to be a perfectly psychologically healthy person, but just any reasonable person. The happier you are, the happier you'll make them. So it does actually help other people. And conversely, when you help someone else without expecting anything in return, it feels good. So it makes you happy. So in fact, both will have the same result ultimately, but it is very important to do both, which for reasons I hope I made clear.
No, I think you have. And it also stems back to the other point that we were discussing earlier about the discipline and doing something you love. It's the balance, really. It's that harmony. Because as well, what I've been learning about is when something is skewed more one way than the other, when you're out of balance, then there's not that harmonization in your energy or in your life, which can, lead to other things. So yeah, this makes
Absolutely.
sense.
And I would say, and I know this sounds like general advice, but I am very specifically saying, ask yourself every day, what can I do to make myself happy today? And what can I do to make someone else feel happy? Again, without expecting anything in return. And then ask yourself at the end of the day, what have I done? Right? Right. Really try and make it a habit. And I would say there's very little that you can do to improve your relationships with people in general more than this. Being happy is charismatic. It attracts people to you. It draws people to you. The more pleasant you are, the more desirable company you are, and the more people treat you well. Again, unless they're the worst type of person who you don't want in your life. And conversely, the more that you do things for other people selflessly without expecting things in return, the more that they're going to appreciate you, the more they're going to like you, the more they're going to even respect you, as long as you're not doing it in a martyring, self-sacrificing kind of way, as long as you're still looking after yourself as well. So, it's the best of all worlds. And for someone who is not great at being good at relationships like me, I would say this is really helpful advice for me. It may be really obvious to someone who's already very, emotionally and relationship focused and in tune, but there's a lot of us who aren't. So I think it's a really good thing to focus on in that case.
Yeah, a good point. I also think too that even though you might have somebody that is relationship focused, but sometimes you forget. And it's because as you were just discussing this, I was like, oh gosh, it feels like it's been a long time since I've really done something for, an immediate family member or things like that. And it just took me back to, and I can't remember when I was doing it, but when my husband would walk through the door and he'd been at the studio or whatever all day, and I just shout, husband, like that, say that really loud. And he was like, oh, that was a nice greeting. And it was just the simplest thing, but put a smile on his face. It put a smile on my face. And it was just one of those things of how simple a joyous greeting and the effect that gave. And that was something nice, not, for him, but also for me.
Yeah. It could just be a genuine compliment. It could even just be a smile. And as much as I do think you should focus this on the people in your life, I think in a way it's even more beneficial to do it to people who you're never going to see again and have no relationship to, because then the self-serving thing is completely removed from that. Because of course, if you're nice to your wife or your husband, you will expect they're going to treat you better. So there's a little bit of that. But if you do it to someone who, you there's no reason to. And by the way, if you do it to that person who there's no social obligation to, that also makes them feel like the world is a benevolent place, which goes back to what we said of gratitude. So you're actually helping them to experience that feeling of gratitude. Maybe not towards you, right? Because often
Doesn't matter.
you don't get to see the beneficial impact it's had on them if it's a stranger or someone who who you don't know otherwise. But yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, what do they call that? The butterfly effect. You have no idea what that will spread out to in the world, because that you may just have changed that stranger's day.
Yeah. Or the pay it forward idea, right? You're just giving stuff to people, and then if everyone does that, then it's a much better world. So
This list has been utterly fantastic. Elwin, can you please introduce our next most effective daily habit?
absolutely. So a daily habit, which I highly recommend for health, and this is more of a obvious one maybe, but maybe not, is eating healthy foods that you enjoy with every meal. So again, as with many of these daily habit recommendations, there's a bit of a conflict there. A lot of people feel like they can either eat healthy foods or they can eat something they enjoy.
Very good point. Because a lot of people do not equate healthy with enjoyment.
And in fact, because they have that black and white view of it, what I observe is that a lot of people will bounce between the two. So sometimes they'll eat healthily, maybe during a purge kind of phase, and then other times they'll eat unhealthily during a binge phase. This is very unhealthy. It's very unhealthy, obviously, to be binging on things that are bad for you, but it's actually also not healthy psychologically to be eating things that are quote unquote good for you, but that you don't enjoy. That's not great either. Forcing things down you that you don't really want is also not good for you. So what's the resolution? It's to find that which is good for you and which you enjoy and focus on that. Now, that overlap may not be great for you. The first thing that I would say is you may need to reevaluate what isn't healthy. One of the, people who we've talked about recently in these episodes is Ray Peat, who, questions a lot of the basic underlying assumptions of biochemistry, which is very interesting to me. But he also did that with food, right? And it said this idea that sugar is bad for you, or chocolate is bad for you, or fruits are bad for you, maybe all these things that a lot of people enjoy, or saturated fat like dairy and cream is bad for you. Ice cream, for instance, he talked about. There's not many people who don't enjoy ice cream, right? Now,
very true.
Having said that, I haven't had ice cream in years, I'll be honest. So I'm a bit of a hypocrite with mentioning that one. But the idea, so first of all, question what isn't healthy, right? It may not only be that salad is healthy and everything else is unhealthy, right? There may be more nuance to it than that. Second of all, it may depend on your genetics. We've talked about this before, right? With carbs, high carb versus high fat. Some people do well with carbs, some people don't. Let's say you love carbs, but they're not good for you. Your genetics say they're not good for you. Your experience says they're not good for you. Does that mean that you now have to eat foods that you don't enjoy? No, because even though maybe you enjoy carbs, maybe it's just not good for you and you do much better when you have low carbs, fair enough. But there must be other things you enjoy, other tastes. Generally, from a chef's point of view, the four flavors, that everyone enjoys are fatty, sour, salt, and sweet. And I say sour is the one that people question a little bit, but, like salt and vinegar and, like all that kind of thing. Sour is generally popular. Less popular is bitter. Less popular is astringent, although certain times bitter is popular, like obviously chocolate is bitter. Less, spicy sometimes isn't popular. But everyone loves sweet. Everyone loves salty. Everyone loves creamy, fatty. And, within that context, at least, everyone loves sour as well, right? Everyone loves a little bit of lemon juice with their, whatever. So let's say you can't have much sweets. And because you can't do carbs. This is just an example. I don't recommend artificial sweeteners. I'm not going that way. What you still can have is delicious savory food, right? You can still have fatty. You can still have sour. You can still have salty. So you can still enjoy your meals. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't have to be that black and white thinking. The other thing is, now I mentioned ice cream as an example. Ice cream may not be good for you, right? Full stop. Maybe saturated fat isn't good for you. Maybe sugar isn't good for you. Carbs aren't good for you, whatever.
Yeah,
but let's just say
maybe you love ice cream, but you're allergic to dairy or something like that. You just can't. Yeah, it's just not possible.
Yeah, that's another example. But in that case, you could have coconut ice cream, right? Which is what I was going to get to. So I don't think, no matter how much you enjoy it, the ice cream from the store, cheap ice cream from the store, is probably not going to be good for you. It's probably going to be full of chemicals. It might have, high fructose corn syrup. It's probably doesn't even have much cream, if any. It's probably going to be garbage. But some homemade ice cream with, organic 100% grass-fed cream, maybe sugar or maybe honey, something like that, right? Some kind of natural sweetener. Maybe, again, egg yolks from chickens that you've got outside or your neighbors do. I can't remember the full ice cream recipe, but those are the basic ingredients. And then whatever flavor, right? Some raw organic cacao powder or some, raw wild blueberries or whatever flavor you want. A little bit of organic vanilla. That's actually not that bad. Again, depending on your genetics, but that could actually be good for you. And that maybe if making your own ice cream sounds like a lot of effort, another example, if you really enjoy meat, then that's great. But make sure it's, 100% grass fed or 100% pasture raised or, whatever. Like, have the good version. If you love pizza, go for it. But, make sure that, again, make it yourself and make it from someone who what the ingredients they're using, they're ingredients that you're happy with, right? Make sure that the cheese that they're using is actually organic, because non-organic cheese is really not good. Often there's all kinds of hormones and all kinds of chemicals in there that you really don't want. If gluten doesn't agree, if you go for the gluten-free version. You see where I'm going with this, right? Like, the black and white thinking of it can either be good for me or I can enjoy it is just fundamentally false. It may be tricky. It may not be easy. If you've got a bunch of intolerances and a bunch of limiting factors, maybe if you've got a low budget, there are all kinds of things that can make it not easy to find food that you enjoy that is healthy for you. But I would say in the vast majority of cases, it is possible. It is possible. And a lot of that is also just learning a little bit of food preparation. An example is adding salt to things. We've talked about salt before, how I don't believe it's bad in most cases. Even if someone has an issue with salt, I would say if you have enough potassium with it, then it kind of balances it out. So it's really not a big deal. This is not a boast because it was not a particularly big deal, but I, used to work for a chain of fairly good quality Italian restaurants that was based on a celebrity chef. And I participated in their Chef of the Year competition. I don't know how many people did it, a few hundred. And I ended up being, a finalist. But what I observed when I was in the kitchen, I was observing what other people were doing. And I noticed they put so much effort into their meals. And in many ways, what they did was better than me. Honestly. With one exception, they didn't put salt in. So you put all this effort into producing this beautiful, fine Italian meal. And then, the judges would try it and be like, doesn't taste of anything. Gone. With me, I don't know if the only thing I did to deserve, the place that I got to more than most of my compatriots, fellow workers, was just seasoning it correctly. That's literally all there is to it. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Is there the right amount of salt? Is there the right amount of sour? Assuming it's a savory dish, usually you want some degree of sour, even if it's a little bit. Could it be improved with a little bit of creaminess in some way? And yeah, I mean, that's for savory food. And then, obviously with dessert. So with dessert, you're going more with sweet. With savory, you're going more with salt. But actually, it's a little bit of both. Like often a dessert is improved by just a little bit of salt, right? And then a savory is improved by just a hint of sweetness, right? I mean, one of the cheats we used to use, just a tiny bit of sugar or something in tomato sauce. Just takes the edge off the sourness, and then, people then love it. Like, oh, it's so nice. So it's just the balance of those flavors. That's not that difficult to learn, honestly. You just experiment in your kitchen with, adding a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Maybe you can't do it yourself. As long as there's someone in your life who prepares food, who you can guide to do this, and you just give them honest feedback. So I'm so sorry, this is not a criticism, but I'd really love it if, it was a little bit more this or a little bit more that. Or you can even, have condiments with you. If, like just make sure you have a bit of salt, a bit of, lemon juice, maybe something, a little bit of coconut oil or MCT oil that you can add to the food. Like you can make it the way that you want it fairly easily. So I have a golden rule. I follow this 100% of the time. Most of the daily habit recommendations I follow, I don't do 100% of the time. But I always do this. I never eat something unhealthy. And by my standards, right? Whatever that may be. So meaning I'm never eating something going, oh, I shouldn't have eaten that. Never, ever, ever, ever. Because I enjoy my food every time. So why would I eat something that is bad for me, right? The only reason that I would eat something that's bad for me is because, and people talk about convenience as well and all the rest of it, like, oh, I just ate it because I was out and I was hungry. But even with that, you can prepare for that. The reason why, even when I used to travel a lot, like a third of the year, I would be away. I would not ever again eat anything that I would consider as unhealthy, is because I would either go to somewhere that had food that I was happy with if I was eating out, or I'd bring something with me. And again, bringing something with you is a lot more of an appealing proposition if you enjoy what you normally eat than if you don't. Right? So if you're normally eating, like bland salads or whatever that you think is healthy that you don't enjoy, of course you're not going to remember to take that with you when you go out and you're going to, oh, I had to eat a pizza or whatever. It's obvious, right? But if you love what you eat every day at every meal, and then you're much more likely to go, oh, I'll just bring some of it with me. I'll make sure I have some of it with me.
Yeah, it's a really great point, especially how you kicked it off with what the definition of healthy or unhealthy or good for you or bad for you is. I think there's also something to be said for where you're talking about the balance of the flavors, because what I've also come across is there's a lot of people whose palate is so skewed down a way that is overly salty, overly sweet. So in bringing them back to a more of a balanced space, sometimes it can take a little time for that palate to desensitize because it's been oversensitized as well. Can you talk to how somebody could do that or what that process would be?
I'd slightly disagree with that, although I'd agree. So where I think people's palate has been desensitized is with artificial food stimulants, right? So there's MSG and all kinds of other things like MSG with a different name. Any chemical that you see in your food, if you're able to, first of all, if you buy packet food from the supermarket with more than one ingredient, always check the ingredient label. If there's anything that you don't recognize, either Google it, look it up and make sure you're happy with it, or don't buy it, don't eat it. When you go out to eat in restaurants, it's trickier, but because of the allergy issues, often they will, if you ask, bring you a list of ingredients and then you can do the same thing. So I think it's more MSG and stuff like that that completely messes up people's taste buds. I actually think, like, with salt and sweetness and stuff like that, if you haven't messed up your taste buds with those flavor chemicals, then if you have the desire, it's valid. If you desire sweet, even if it's a lot, it's because you need carbs. If you desire salty, it's because you need salt. If you desire acid, I know that may seem, if you desire sour, but that may seem more obscure, but my belief is that really supports the digestive process, the stomach and the liver specifically. It helps to stop cholestasis in the liver and it kind of supplements lack of acid in the stomach. So I actually believe that all of those kind of typical cravings and creamy and fat I didn't do. But again, it's a source of fuel that's very, very important. So I would say if you have any of those cravings, don't try and reduce the craving, but try and find the best quality thing that will satisfy you. So if you're craving something sweet, don't go for the junk that's also full of omega-6s and chemicals and all kinds of bad things. Go for the very best sweet fruit, maybe like a really ripe piece of fruit that is absolutely full of sucrose, but still is actually better for you. And I won't go for all the examples, but ditto for all of them, right? Just find the best. Well, I'll go for a couple. If you're desiring creamy foods, then don't go through the soy oil, vegetable oil crap that is sold these days in packets. Go for what is best for you. Maybe that's saturated fats like coconut oil, MCT oil, I'm a big fan of, or maybe it's animal fats, butter. Maybe it's monounsaturated fats, like olive, avocado, things like that. But, go for whatever you decide is the best for you and then just really enjoy it.
Right. So if somebody's new to this, let's say, and they're used to when they're wanting something sweet, and they're potentially reaching for a candy bar or something like that, when they're trying to make better choices, they could potentially reach for something that is going to be made with more natural ingredients than something that is not.
Yeah, maybe naturally sweet fruit or honey or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Great. Really, really great. Well, Ellen, this has been a fantastic, wonderful, wonderful very informative for me as well. Time spent with you today on the podcast. So before we close, are there any final thoughts that you want to say?
Yeah, if you're watching this, please share. We're doing our best to grow the channel, without paying for advertising or anything like that. So it's difficult, or we really appreciate you sharing this. And if a whole episode seems like too much to share, we do have clips these days. We have a playlist for, all kinds of different clips in the playlist section, or you can just find our clips on our channel. Please share our clips. Please share what we have to say. Anything that you actually like, of course. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Fantastic, Elwin. And also, if you have any daily habits that you think are highly effective, share them in the comments. Let us read them. We'd love to engage and see what else you guys have got that we can look into as well. So please make sure that you hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon so you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you next time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode. And one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there. Or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.